Welcome to the 7th installment of Breaking Bread, a 10-part series that explores the shared and disparate experiences of local migrant communities. And just for the overview, we share stories of family, tradition, trauma, exchange, and each episode features the shared experience of food, hence breaking bread as a guiding metaphor. To watch previous programs in this series, you can find them all on the McLean County Museum of History YouTube website. I am broadcasting from the McLean County Museum of History this evening, and our program is delightfully named Hot Dog, It Could Be Wurst, German Cookery. And I have Greg Koos here with me, who is the Executive Director Emeritus of the museum, and I'm delighted to say a good friend of mine. And I also have Terra Brockman, who is a writer, food activist, and founder of The Land Connection, which you will be learning more about shortly. Before I officially kick off the program, I do want to share the McLean County Museum of History's acknowledgement statement for the use of the land, which is a formal recognition that respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards. The land we call McLean County is the ancestral land of many Native groups, beginning with the Paleo Indians 12,000 years ago, and most recently Algonquin-speaking groups, including the Kickapoo, who were forced west from this area in the 1830s. And as always, I am ever grateful for our valuable partners, Being Welcoming, which is a coalition of the Immigration Project, Not in Our Town, Not in Our Schools, the West Bloomington Revitalization Project, the Mennonite Church of Normal, and the First United Methodist Church, who work together to create a supportive environment for immigrants across McLean County. We are partnering with Design Street Studio at Illinois State University in their expertise with our graphics, and Heartland Community College, our partners in education. Now back to the program. As before, you may post questions or comments in the chat feature at any time, and we will close in about an hour for an opportunity to respond to your questions and engage with conversation about the program. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you, Greg, and you can get us going with some historical context.
Current technologies, hot dog. It could be bratwurst, German cookery. And I think, of course, we associate things like hot dogs and things like sausages with German cuisine for very good reasons. But there's a thing about cuisine that we have to really think about. And it has a lot to do with many of us who live in the Midwest, that food really is a type of deep memory. Food traditions sometimes are surprisingly deep in terms of how far back in time they go. And the one story I would like to share with you is the discovery of doomies. My grandfather, when I was a child, would cook these. I didn't know the name until much later, what I called giant pancakes. And as I became older and I asked my mother about them, and she said, well, we've never written it down. It came from her great-great-grandmother, a woman by the name of Lydia Shively. And so it came, and they never really wrote it down as a family thing. And so I asked her, please write it down. And because I enjoy cooking and I wanted to cook doomies, partially out of my fondness and my memory of my grandfather, and in another sense, wanting to reach back deeply into time. So doomies are essentially a really egg-rich, fat pancake that the recipe's here, and you'll be able to download the recipe as well, is a fat pancake that is, I love this, some of the language of the recipe. You use a scant cup of milk. That's not a full cup. It's not a half a cup. It's a scant cup. And in the sense that, this is a recipe for people who are doing a considerable amount of physical work. You cook it in a hot skillet, you fry it in a hot skillet with a generous amount of grease. And I've made these with lard, I've made them with butter, I've made them with goose fats, I made them with duck fats. Duck fat and goose fat is really good stuff for these. You brown them, And this is what's unusual. You flip them and they're pretty thick. You can see the picture of them there. And then when they're about done in the bottom, you cut them up. I cut them up with knives and forks, and because that's the way our family did it. And then we always had it with maple syrup. So I was talking to a German friend of mine, Hannah Heckman, who was born in 1952, lives in Heidelberg. And I was telling her about this, and she says, well, that's Kaiserschmarrn. I said, well, what is it? And she says, oh, it's a dish that we fix. And I explained the way we fixed it. And she says, well, the way you eat it's like a child eats it. We only let children eat it this way, with all that sugar stuff. She says, adults eat it with a hot winter salad, something like a rotkohl, a red cabbage and apple salad, a hot salad, cooked salad on top of it. But in any case, it was fascinating to me that the recipe that had been passed down through multiple generations is very, very similar to Hannah's Kaiserschmarrn. And I checked out some of the ingredients, and it's very, very similar. 300 grams of flour is about 2 cups. And so it works out. I guess I use 2 eggs and she says 3 to 4 eggs. So hers is more egg rich than mine. Maybe my Pennsylvania Dutch ancestors, because these people were Pennsylvania Dutch, didn't have as access to eggs as people in Heidelberg do today. So as we think about foods, and our families, we need to think about how some of these dishes that we just have on a very regular basis may really reach deeply into our past. Now, Germans in McLean County started coming in the early 1830s. And what brought Germans? Immigration is push-pull. And what pushed people out of Germany was religious intolerance, political intolerance, starvation or near starvation, poor food supply, and war. And so with multiple kinds of things like that, the people who came here from Germany as early as 1830, the first group were German Mennonites, and they came to farm. That's what pulled them in. They didn't necessarily come directly from Germany. Many of them were in Pennsylvania a generation or two, and then came kind of like my Shively relatives. And so they dealt with issues of war because these are pacifistic people. And so they dealt with issues of religious discrimination because they were not members of a state church. Jews, the first Jew recognized by a German historian of Bloomington in 1910, he said the first German in McLean County, he didn't apparently recognize the Mennonites as such, was a Jewish guy by the name of Stern, who was a back peddler. And that meant he put his goods on his back and he walked through rural area, actually worked out of Leroy, and sold pins and papers and just light things, and ended up coming to Bloomington and went into the jewelry business with a guy by the name of Freeburg. In 1848, we had a middle-class group of Germans come to McLean County. And these are referred to as the 48ers, and they were on the losing side of a liberal revolution, of a revolution that meant to overthrow the ruling class, in this case, the Kaiser, the royalty, the nobles, and institute parliamentary democracy, and they lost. And so tens of thousands of those folks came over, and many, many of them settled in McLean County. These people were not religious. They were free thinkers. They called themselves atheistic materialists. And but at the same time, in some ways, the Lutherans are the next people to come in, and these Lutherans are Missouri Synod Lutherans. They were considered old Lutherans in Germany, very strict, and their methods of observation of their religious beliefs did not link with the state Lutheran Church, and they wanted freedom to worship and freedom to observe God in their manner, and leaving was a way of doing that. They also were people who were very closely tied to the land, and issues of food security definitely affected them. Catholics started coming in, and really a little bit before the Civil War, but most of the significant settlement taking place after the Civil War. Religious freedom was an issue for these folks, but also another piece that was happening was the economic opportunity, but also the unification of the German states meant that young Catholic men were expected to fight in the Prussian-dominated army. And many of these Catholics viewed that as being required to fight for a Protestant king, and they weren't willing to do so. So there were some religious, political kinds of things. And we also had then really pre-war and post-World War II refugees of the Nazi terror, survivors of the death camps, displaced persons whose lives were completely upset. My parents hosted the Rabbi Rothschild in their home immediately after the war, him having no place to go and looking for a place where he could work with a temple and have a better life, and put behind him what had happened to his family in Germany. The Germans are class conscious, and so I use class consciousness here. Working class immigrants clearly made up the largest bulk of the Germans who came here. Germany in the period of 1840 to 1870, 1880 was primarily rural. It was about 80% rural. So that is that the people who were coming out of a rural situation. They're coming off of small farms. They had inheritance customs that said that a father died, the farm was then divided evenly among all the children. And so that creates smaller farms. That's kind of like what was happening with the Irish, if you recall my Irish lecture. These families were forced to produce food on less land. And so, of course, like the Irish were also forced into it, they really went over to the potato for their subsistence. And the Germans also suffered a potato famine, but nothing as dramatic as what the Irish did. But food security was not real for them. There were food issues, and actually that food crisis of Germany certainly added to the tumult that ended up with the 1848 revolution. In terms of most of them didn't really own land. Most were really laborers. As you see these farms getting smaller, people are going to be pushed and simply go into agricultural labor work. Or some of them were on tenants, workers on short-term lease. But what I'm trying to get at is that, and also from the towns and cities, that these working class immigrants did not migrate with money. They did not have a lot when they got here. Probably everything that they had to put together financially to get here went for transportation. And then it was a matter of trying to figure out how they would get there from there. My own grandfather had enough money to get to from Hamburg to New York City, and he was going to join family in Bloomington, but he didn't have any way to get to Bloomington except for to walk. So it'd be a very typical kind of an immigrant. And he walked from New York to Bloomington. The largest number, again, of Germans in McLean County were these working class people. But they succeeded here in many, many ways. It became a place, we don't really think of this, but Germans were really represented 30% of the county. That is that by 1900, 1 out of 3 people were German speaking in a family, whether they were first or second generation. So the German presence here was very strong and very, very significant to what Bloomington and McLean County and our other communities became. The middle-class immigrants had a different kind of experience. They were able to afford passage on good ships. The image you see, the cartoon that you see here, titled "A Day in Castle Garden," the papa is saying, "This must be the place. This is where we're at," and the family is ready to. A little scared. I think little boy is looking, thinking, "What's my life going to be?" But he came. He's a fat man. He's got a gut on him. Okay, he's well fed. Many Germans had skills when they migrated. the difference between Ireland and Germany, a significant difference, was that Germans were making things. They were a country that was producing. They had factories, they had shops. They were not a colonial society where everything was shipped in from elsewhere. And so many of these folks ended up, or had, these middle-class people had significant skills. They had business skills, running dry goods stores, jewelry. The needle trades was a place where a lot of Germans worked. They were involved in buying and selling of dry goods, of cloth, of making clothing, these kinds of things. Many of these folks also worked in crafts as machinists, as carpenters, cabinet makers, and whatnot. The Chicago and Alton Railroad shops located in Bloomington provided a tremendous number of jobs to highly skilled German machinists who were needed for establishing the high level of still crafts work needed to work with this new iron and steel technology that Chicago and Alton Railroad was becoming really known for. So these folks had money. They knew they were going to make money when they're going to get here, and they were going to have a pleasant middle-class life. Because these middle-class folks had spendable money, they had capacity, competency, as they call it in the 19th century, they were able to do something which was to enjoy the cuisine that they had in Germany and to reestablish that cuisine by creating new food systems here in McLean County. So that is that the idea is that there are enough Germans here where the kinds of foods that these folks enjoy could be recreated here on the prairie. And so butchers, bakers, grocers, winemakers, breweries, market gardeners, these were all elements, people producing things that were used for German cuisine. And we'll take a look at some of those and some of the people who were making these kinds of foods. And these stories are taken from Julius Dietrich's Bloomington und Bild and Welt. My German is terrible. Any case, he highlighted some of these folks, and maybe they paid to get into his book, I do not know. And I looked up some of these people in the newspapers and whatnot to get a sense of exactly what they were doing. And so German food is rich in meats. And so J.C. Ritz was a butcher, and he advertised nice steer meat sold from the block. And what he means by that is he would cut meat to order. That is, you would go to the counter, you say what you want, he'd pull down a large piece of meat and cut it in front of you and sell it to you, wrap it up and sell it to you. Wieners, he was a sausage maker. He had a guy by the name of Martin Kwosik who was working with him, was making sausage as well. He made wieners. Okay, we all know what a wiener is, ballpark wieners. Wiener, Vienna, okay, that's where that comes from. Bratwurst, which is a bloodwurst. It's a blood sausage, sometimes has some chopped tongue in it. Leberwurst, which is liverwurst. Many of us have had liverwurst and still enjoy it. And Zungenwurst, which is a tongue wurst. And that is kind of like bologna with pieces of tongue in it, would be a good way to describe that. And I have some images of what that stuff looks like. Going to the butcher shop was a male thing in many ways. My father recalled that you would go into a German butcher shop and there would be a barrel of blood with a hollow ox horn that you were expected to dip down into the barrel and drink the blood, to show that you were manly. So there was this kind of creeps me out, but I said, yeah, it's what you did. William Gherkin was a baker, and he was a commercial baker. So that is that he went into the bread making business in a pretty big way, and he sold bread through many retail outlets, mostly locally owned grocery stores. But as a baker of pride, he also would make fine cakes for parties, so nicely frosted, tiered cakes, decorated cakes, and also, numerous kinds of cakes you might serve at a banquet. Gherkin was also a cracker baker, and so he manufactured crackers. His ovens, curiously, were underneath the sidewalks of his building, which was on the northwest corner of Front and East Street, now the site of the government center. And I recall going when his building was being torn down, and you actually see the ovens built into the side, underneath the sidewalks. And of course, candy. We all love candy. And Paul Bike, professional candy maker, confectioner, started out making bonbons, chocolates, and French mixed cream candies. And he said he used only the purest materials, for his candies. And so these are people who are making foods for a community that has the money to buy their delicacies. So here's the sausage that Ritz made. The bratwurst on the left, you can see it's a blood sausage with a filling. Liverwurst is simply a finely ground liver that's packed into a tube. And the Zungenwurst looks like it has a touch of the blood in it, but also a couple other body parts. So what's going on with this stuff? Well, sausage is a food of a peasant class where the organ meats are not readily sold, and they are retained by the farmer, they're retained by the family for their personal consumption, whereas the higher cuts are sold for cash income. So the sausage is a kind of economy food, if you will. The Bikes, he made French creams. So those French creams, essentially a fondant. Okay, so it's a whipped hot sugar, and that is then dyed. So it's basically sugar and food coloring, lightly whipped up enough so it's really a light, like a fondant. Bonbons, we're all familiar with those, like a Fannie Mae or whatnot. And then just good old chocolate, the chocolate bar. Bikes also sold those. Now, Germans also used wine and beer as part of their cuisine. Having wine or beer at a meal would be no more unusual for them than for most of us having salt and pepper. The cuisine and customs required wine, and it was made at home. People made their own wine. Many people made their own wine, fermenting it in a basement, transferring it into casks, and then bottling it. So you started in the fall, and in May and June, you bottle it when it's still slightly effervescent. They prized that kind of lightness to their wines. And most of the wines they made were whites, but they did make some reds. And there's a guy who really kind of exemplifies this culture of home winemaking and the enjoyment of wines, and his name was Wilhelm Schmidt. And he had a large country house on what is today called Bloomington Heights. And it used to be called Wilhelmshof. It used to be called Williams Heights, named after him. And after World War I, during World War I, they changed it to Bloomington. They thought having it named Wilhelm was unpatriotic. He made his whites, and he served his whites, and he served them under a wild apple tree that he did topiary work with, so that he could create this beautiful centerpiece for conversation. So his friends would gather, maybe a half dozen, and sit underneath this beautiful topiary apple tree. Now you can imagine what that thing was like in the spring. You get your fresh wines and you get the blossoms and whatnot. It'd be just a very sensual kind of thing. And it was what they would write. One of the people is Dietrich, who wrote this reminiscence, that when the moon was high, they talk of philosophy and life until late in the evening. And quote, as Faust would have it said, let the moment live forever. It's a very, very German kind of concept. That's not drunkenness. That is the delight of the lightness of wine and the good fellow spirits of who you are sharing your philosophical and great thoughts of the evening with. Well, Schmidt, in order to create this kind of piece of happiness that he wanted to create, needed to make wine, which meant that he needed to get grapes, and it's a heck of a lot more efficient to grow your own grapes. And so you need rootstock. And two people in town were growing grape rootstock, Herman Schrader and John Lang. Lang's winery was on the west side of Bloomington. It was about, if you know where the Wayman AME Church is at Allen and Grove Street. It was about, maybe 300 feet beyond that corner. And Lang started producing about 1860. Herman Schrader preceded him. Schrader started producing grape stock root and making wine in the late 1850s. Schrader got his start by buying wine stock root from Nicholas Longworth, who was a great propagator of this, who lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. And so Lang's winery building is still standing. And this was a bit of a discovery to really work this out. But at 817 West Grove Street, if you drive by, you see this brick house painted white and blue. That was Lang's winery. And it had a very, very deep cellar, because not only was he, of course, growing grapes, but he also produced wine in limited amounts for sale, as much to demonstrate the quality of his rootstock as anything else. And his ad that was placed in the Prairie Farmer, and a Midwest distributed agricultural newspaper. He was growing Concord, Delaware, Hartford Prolific, Norton's Virginia, seedlings, etc. And he did well. He did well with this. He made enough where he went back home for a while, at least. Now, breweries were a different situation, because they're like Schmidt. Drinking for Germans is a social thing. It's not something you do to get drunk. It's something you do to share with another person. And breweries were places that manufactured beer specifically to serve saloons and taverns and clubs. And you could also, get a pail of it to take home. The first brewery in town was started at today's Highland Golf Course, started by Christian Margraf in about 1856. And soon after, a fellow by the name of Stein started a brewery in Stein's Grove, and today we call that Forest Park. And Stein did a couple of things a little differently. He did have his brewery, but he also put up a dance pavilion where on Sundays people could come and listen to German band music and dance and enjoy the summer air in a grove. It would have been a very, very delightful kind of situation. The Meyer and Walkner family acquired the brewery in 1863, and they were helped along the way by two guys who started a malt house for malting barley. And it's that malted barley that really starts and creates the opportunity for Germans to make beer at home, because home beer production is certainly possible, as we know today from the many, many people who are making beer at home. So Myers did well. They had extra select. They had lots of different kinds of beers, Bock beers and whatnot. It did very well. They did not survive a Bloomington prohibition movement in 1904, 1905. And so they tried to hang on, but the Prohibition Act absolutely destroyed their ability for making beer locally. It's sad, because by all accounts, it was really good stuff. Now, so we've got, meat makers and candy makers and whatnot, but garden produce, vegetables are clearly the best way for folks to get, their full meal. And so many of the Germans who came here, they had large lots in many cases, whatnot, but city dwellers can't grow as much as market gardeners can. And so a fellow by the name of Philip Biderman started the first market garden in town. If you think about Kroger store on North Main Street in Bloomington, that was located about there. But in 1856, Herman Schrader really went into this big time, and he started his market garden immediately north of Bloomington, the old city cemetery. And if you look at that, there's a slope there, and you can see from this image from 1867, you can see that he's also starting some grapes. These are posts that are for his grapevines. And so he's growing a variety of things. And the market gardening becomes a very, very important part of German cuisine. Schrader's a really interesting guy. He's an 1848er. That is, he's a refugee. He said, he wrote in his autobiography, and I, as a leader of the revolution in North Germany, was condemned to be shot to death. And I took my young wife and escaped at night and was pursued by hundreds of gendarmes. I fled to America, the land of the free. So he's a man who has this sense of greatness, if you will, because it's all about him. This guy's, a lot of his life is all about him. He starts out as a doctor, but I like to say he made a better gardener than a doctor. Okay, so you're much happier that he'd get you beets as opposed to that he would cut into you. And the foods that he grew, the wide variety of foods that he grew, are really quite interesting, because he grew and sold asparagus, rhubarb, potatoes, cabbage, cauliflower, celery, onions, bunch beans, beets, okra, carrots, cucumbers, and radishes. And he also grew fruits, currants, strawberries, raspberries, and of course, grapes. And what's interesting is people in Bloomington were not familiar with a lot of these kinds of produce. They simply were unfamiliar with them. And so he knew that the stuff that they were not going to eat, that he could sell in Chicago markets, and would actually crate up and ship stuff out in the morning express that left here about 5:30 in the morning, and get it up to Chicago by about 10 around 10 o'clock or so. He was very conscious of maintaining soil fertility on his land. So he bought this land. He added animal manure, food waste from restaurants. I don't know if he composted it. I'm sure he did. Ashes from soap factory, oyster shells from saloons. A lot of that, in a sense, looks like, to me, I'm looking at what was left about his writing, about what he was doing. It looks to me like that's what you're really putting together for a really high quality compost. He was proud that he could start plants in February and March. He would use window sash and built cold frames, and he heated his cold frames by rotted manure. So he'd get fresh manure and pile it in there, get it in the sun, and the heat created from that was enough to create heat to start his plants. The guy was really pretty creative about how he was going about things. By 1890, he went entirely over into grapes and was propagating about 90 different varieties. Well, market gardening is a piece that we have not left behind. It's a piece that actually we've regathered. And we're going to hear from Terra Brockman, who grew up in Central Illinois, and she's the fourth of 5 generations of local farmers. And the barn that you see on the right, 1915, that's the Brockman farm in Livingston County. And Terra, in her World Travelers, really figured out that the quality of food we were getting here in Central Illinois was nowhere as good as the quality of food people were experiencing all across the world. And so she really has led this movement, the Land Connection, to look at, on a systematic method and a systematic way, of how a collection of independent producers can change the way we eat and can change our ability to access good foods. And I'd like to welcome Terra to us. Good evening, Terra.
Hi, thank you, Greg. Well, I'll take it away here and talk a little bit about, can everyone hear me? The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? It looks like Herman Schrader and my family are doing very similar things just 150 years later. Although, you know, it wasn't that long ago. It was my grandparents' time. In that barn picture you saw is actually 1912 when that barn was built, but they came in the probably mid 1800s with the Lutheran immigrants. And you know, actually, you know more about this than I do, but it was about having your own piece of land and your own food security. I mean, everyone had different reasons, as you say, push and pull, the immigrant experience. My family didn't talk a lot about it, but I think partially there was some religious aspect to it. And there was a lot of just, you know, work hard, get an education, better yourself. and you know, the American dream, right? So my family on my father's side, the Brockman side, is a German immigrant ancestry. My grandmother was Dutch immigrant, but sort of a similar time frame and similar stories. They got their 160 acres there in Iroquois County, so not exactly McLean County, but not too far away, and similar in some ways. And their farm was biodiverse and what we would call organic and sustainable, because that was what farms were. And at the time, my grandparents and great-grandparents had, just about every crop and every animal and every fruit and vegetable you could think of, although their vegetable offerings were a little bit in the corn, beans, potatoes, cabbage. It didn't go too much further than that. But they did have extensive orchards with apples, pears, primarily apples, pears, because those you could save through the winter, but other fruits as well. And then everything from your horse for power on the farm, and then milk cows, beef cows, pigs, sheep. What did they have? They had all kinds of feathered creatures. So everything from chickens and ducks and geese and turkeys. And a part of this was for your family, but a lot of it was exactly what you said, except it was a different railway. They were on the railway that went up to Chicago. I believe it was Illinois Central, although you might be able to correct me on that. But it went right through all those small towns. And the small town that my grandparents are from is Danforth, Illinois. If any of the listeners know the Danforth-Gilman area. In fact, Interstate 57 cut right a corner off of my grandparents' farm. So if you go on 57, you can actually see that 1912 barn if you are looking up at the right time. So that's my little bit of my family immigrant history on that side. But the interesting thing is that the farming skipped a generation with my father, who is like, okay, you're the smart kid, go to college. And some of the listeners here might know that my dad, Herman Brockman, nice German name, Herman, also, he would have liked to have been a farmer, but he's like, smart kid, go to college. And he was a professor at Illinois State University for 35 years, teaching genetics in the biology department. But as soon as my dad retired in 1998, he began to help my brother, Henry. So Henry is the organic vegetable farmer, market gardener. My sister Teresa is the organic fruit farmer, fruits and herbs. My other sister Jill is back on the family farm, the 1912 barn farm. And that one, she's doing the milling. So she's back to milling, back to having fine products for bakers, right? Freshly stone milled grains, everything from wheat and rye to buckwheat, to corn, to oats, and probably soon barley and a few other things. Also ancient grains, but that's a whole nother story. So we have a vegetable farm, we have the fruit farm, we have the miller, and growing some organic grains on that old family farm. And then we have my other niece doing organic flowers. So, the beauty of flowers also for your table. So we are sort of now become a family of local food production and trying to go back to maybe what those folks you just talked about, Mr. Schrader and others, were all about, having fresh taste. And now we know that taste equals nutrition. And we know about biodiversity and how that is an insurance policy because all your eggs aren't in one basket. So we're practicing similar thing on our farming and being direct to consumer, getting your stuff to either a very local market or the Chicago market. And oddly enough, what they were doing back then is exactly what our family is kind of doing now. It's funny how things kind of sometimes come around. But the interesting thing, I was just going to tell maybe one small story, and then I was going to maybe go forward into some immigrant connections that are happening right now. The small story is that when my mother, who was of Italian immigrant ancestry, not the topic of today's discussion, but she, her parents were from the old country. She grew up speaking Italian on the south side of Chicago. So she meets this guy, Herman Brockman, in college and goes to meet his family because they're getting serious, and goes to my grandparents' farm where my grandmother had made her specialty, rhubarb pie. My mother had no idea what rhubarb was, but she knew what pie was. And so she eagerly sort of took a slice of pie, and she said she took a bite and she just had to restrain herself from spitting it out because it wasn't what she expected. It was tart, it was weird. And she said never in her life had she experienced rhubarb pie before. And she said it was like one of these most horrible things, but she knew if I'm going to marry into this family, I have to pretend to enjoy this. So it was a bit of a cultural, tricky maneuvering right there. And of course now, my brother grows a ton of rhubarb and my sister as well. And, we're all growing rhubarb, which used to be in a lot of people's backyards, right? Here in town, Bloomington Normal and everywhere. And I understand now, because we sell a lot of rhubarb, that not everyone has a rhubarb plant in their backyard anymore, which I don't quite understand why, because it's quite easy. It's a perennial. But anyway, so that was a weird cross-cultural thing that happened. But the market farming, I think, is it's had a little resurgence, partially thanks to COVID, perhaps, but it is about not only the freshness of the produce, the taste and the nutrition, but the connection, human connection, and the breaking of bread, together, or at least knowing who raised, where did that carrot come from? Where did that apple come from? So I think, again, we're getting back at some basic things that our immigrant ancestors knew to be of value. And then I'm just sort of, my current life in the past year or so, I've been very close to a Guatemalan family of asylum seekers that came to Eureka, sponsored by the Roanoke Mennonite Church. So here we have this weird but oddly same. When you read the words of, which of the immigrants was it who said, he was escaping violence and death, death threats, or he would have been killed for his, beliefs. Why do people leave countries around the world? My Italian immigrant family was starving. They had nothing. They had no land. They had no food. The entire village of southern Italy left because there was just no way to live. So this Guatemalan family, again, yes, there was violence, always threats of violence, real violence. There was, they had nothing. They had a shack with no electricity, no running water. They had no food except what they could grow or beg. And so a family comes here and, we try to open our arms and welcome them just as people, welcomed us or our ancestors. And the interesting thing there too is that she was amazed at the selection of food here. You go to any grocery store or heaven, like Walmart, Costco, and you are just like floored by the abundance. But then she realized that buying a watermelon there and being very disappointed, or buying sweet corn there and being very disappointed. And then when I bring her my brother's sweet corn or my brother's watermelon, and then she's like, yes, this is it. This is the real thing. And that's because it's fresh and local, which, again, coming full circle, was exactly my experience when I was traveling the world and going to war-torn Eritrea and, incredibly, poor places. And what do you get? I got scrambled eggs, like a frittata with a hen who just laid an egg and herbs that were growing right outside. And you put those things together, you have a fabulous meal, better than you might get most places right around here. So anyway, there's a realization, I think that that local food is not just a trend. It is a trend, but it has human connection, and it has taste and nutrition, and it's from somebody who cares about the land and the water and the air and the quality of all these things that are so basic to our human existence. So I kind of, maybe this is just a little bit of a summary, a little bit of a winding path, but I wanted to kind of leave it open in case we have questions at the end, and I can go deeper into biodiversity, which again is one of my brother's specialties, just like Mr. Schrader was growing all those different things. Henry grows an amazing variety. I had never had fennel or shiso or any number of vegetables, cardoons. I had never heard of them till Henry began to grow them, and many, many varieties of each kind of vegetable. So it's it is so interesting to hear about the early traditions of German immigrants and their biodiverse farming and their sustainable farming, and then how far we kind of went toward an industrialized monocropping system, and now how we're coming sort of slowly back to something that is ecological and makes sense, and that you can feed your community with this kind of farming. So thanks.
Thank you for that a marvelous circle that you have created for us. Much to think about. I'm going to put in a word for the home gardeners. We maybe at the end we can talk a little bit about the intersection of going into the backyard and getting your rhubarb.
Yeah.
Thank you. Making food at home is part of the German food tradition, and many people would, of course, go to the butcher shop to get sausages. But those of us who are searching for great sausages often find that it's something to do at home. And I talked to the mayor about sausage making, and he wanted to know whether he's talking about city ordinances or pork sausage. So we agreed pork sausages were more to the point. And so we have a film clip here of Chris and I making sausage.
Das ist sehr gut. A little high on the salt. No, not really. We've got to wait about 10 minutes to grind that fat, because it needs to be pretty cold.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and mix the meats.
Okay.
And the seasoning, we can put the fat in.
Okay, sure, that makes sense. All right, well, we're going to mix the meats. We've got pork and we've got venison, and that will get mixed up well. It'll get spiced, and because we're really doing a deep chill on the fats, they'll go in last and then be thoroughly mixed into it. Sausage just isn't really great sausage on all fat in it,
You may not need that much fat because
This actually, their pork is fairly lean. It really
Okay.
is. I think this is from Fairbury, isn't it? Yeah, Twin Oaks. Great people in Fairbury who are supplying pork.
Would you go ahead and open that side, Greg?
Okay.
And this is venison that was from Shirley, Illinois.
His name was not Shirley. Shirley, his name was not Shirley.
We didn't interview them
Okay.
before we harvested.
Okay, this is going to be colder than all get out. So what happens is your hands freeze.
Before you mix it too much, Greg, let's go ahead and work some seasoning in.
Sure, happy to do that. You can add it. My hands are greased.
How much sugar? We need a half teaspoon of nutmeg. I'm calling that a half teaspoon.
That's all that nutmeg is.
It's pretty new.
Okay. Yeah, that's nice and fragrant. So that'll work. And white pepper.
A little more just never hurt. That was allspice. Next is marjoram. I looked at a bunch of recipes and every one of them had marjoram. So apparently this is important. And
That's a red pepper. I thought.
yeah, and I gotta put some salt in there too. kosher salt. Mix away, brother.
Okay. Salt is probably the core preservative as part of sausage. That's why the casings are salted. That's why there's salt in the sausage. Anyway, salt is a preservative. I mean, it's a human necessity, but it's also a preservative. Yeah, I'd say we're well mixed.
That mix well?
Don't you think so?
Well, we're going to work the fat in, so we'll
Yeah.
get another mix.
Yeah, when I cook sausage, I started out in a kind of like sauteed water, and I cook it, and then I continue to stab it and turn it, and I continue cooking it, and the fats start coming out of it, and as the water goes down, you start getting a bit of a kind of a darkening, you know, caramelization of the fats and whatnot, and that actually creates a really beautiful media for finishing a sausage off in. Get really nice brown. Boy, almost liquefied it, Chris.
Yeah, it probably should have been colder.
Oh, it doesn't hurt it.
No.
This means I've got to really work it a little more.
Now, if we were doing this without ground, we would have done it with chunks of pork and venison, and then ground it that way and done the fat at the same time.
I insist that half of cooking is done in your nose. You really have to, you can smell whether you've got what you want. And it smells right.
What we're going to do next is we're going to saute a little chunk of this to see what our spice combo is correct or not.
Well, I already gave it the nose test. It was right on the nose. You get that gaminess from the...
What's that?
I said, you get that nice gaminess from the venison, you know?
Das ist sehr gut. A little high on the salt. No, not really. I like it. I do too. And basically, we're rinsing all the salt out of this and the smelly stuff. Are you ready, Watson?
Mm-hmm.
of it. Yeah, that works. You know how they break open when you do it anyway.
Yeah. Not too many pockets at all, really. We did a pretty good job on that.
What do you think about it? That's pretty long.
Pretty long, yeah.
So I'd say
Yeah.
about like that.
Yeah. Mhm. And we leave them in lengths. And so then when it's time to cook them, you cut them at the, Also, I think it really helps pack it a little bit.
It does.
Well, that was an adventure to make sausage with Chris, and it's fun to do. It is even more fun when you can do it with family. So thank you, Chris. That was great. German kitchens where such things are made, and there is thriftiness to the German American household. German Americans were noted for making the most out of the least. Wheat bread from bakers, potatoes, tomatoes, cabbage and onions from the market and home gardeners, and fresh beef and chops from the butchers, but also eggs, milk, cheese, and making sauerkraut. We'll finish with sauerkraut. The cooking was done from scratch. That is that Mama bought some store foods, but cooking from scratch was essential for a middle class or lower middle class, working class family. Food was very expensive at the time. Families in 1900 would spend about 42% of their income on food. And so when we think about the cost of the industrial cuisine, what it does to us, yes, it's inexpensive, but when we start increasing what we spend, the quality that we get and how much better it is for us. So I think one of the reasons why this food was more expensive is because it was better food. Making a chicken dinner, well, you bought a live chicken or a dead chicken, or that was more inexpensive than perhaps, or maybe you raised your own chickens. Housewife knew how to pluck, gut, clean. I mean, just part of the household routine. Most of the cooking was done in the period 1860 to 1900 on coal ranges. So there's a constant process of cleaning out cooled ashes and cinders and regulating heat with dampers and tending the meal. Water was hauled in for kitchen use. Many houses did not have running water. So a woman might have to haul 10, 15, up to 50 gallons of water a day. Water, I believe a pound, how much does a pound of water weigh? I think about 10 pounds. Boiling water for dishwashing. There's an incredible amount of manual, hard, physical labor that was involved in this. And of course, what was not consumed at the meal was served at the next meal. There was no waste. But many of these German traditions started in decline as part of a cultural suppression. There was an anti-immigrant attitudes affected the Germans for really as soon as after they got here. Much of the attitude had to do with the pride of the use of German language and the utilization and creation of German language schools. And many people felt that German language schools, the people who were teaching these were avoiding assimilation, avoiding being Americans, which is not so. They were people who were celebrating bilingualism. One language was a poverty, two languages or more was richness. And so there were attacks on their schools, political attacks. And so there was been an element of opposition to the notion of people celebrating their culture. This really came to a head during World War I, 1917, 1918, when the United States declared war on Germany as essentially at a point that was 3 to 4 years into that war. And war fever and patriotism meant an attack on Germanism. There was an entity called the McLean County Council of Defense that was organized to actually suppress Germans, and suppress they did. The mayor of Bloomington, E.E. Jones, chaired the effort, and it included such things as going to the schools and ensuring and telling those schools that German language, teaching German language was banned. And preaching, and went to the churches. They went to visited the German churches and said, you may not preach in German. You may not conduct your languages in German. Mobs threatened violence. Mobs gathered out in rural McLean County, and 2 Lutheran churches, one at Colfax and one in Anchor. Mobs threatened violence, threatened to throw paint, yellow paint on their buildings, and threatened to burn their prayer books. My dad recalled in 1917, his father came home and said, we can no longer speak German at home. It is forbidden. The Bloomington newspaper, the Bloomington Journal, was a German language newspaper. It was suppressed. They were essentially told, do you like your newspaper as it is, or do you want your newspaper torn up and in the streets? And ordered the paper to print in the English language. Workers were ordered not to use German at work. And of course, again, as I said, families were forbidden or stopped speaking German. This culture war, Kulturkampf, broke the back of that German food system and broke the back of many of the celebrations of the culture that these folks had brought. But at home, home is a stubborn place, and home is a conservative place. And so people continued many of their ways into the 1920s and into the 1940s. My grandparents is who I'm going to speak about here, Vincent and Pauline Koos. They rented a home on a 200 feet deep city lot, and it was on West Taylor Street, 1005 West Taylor. There's a plat map image that shows that to you. They had a very large garden. You see a photograph of my grandfather working in his garden. This photo was taken about 1939, 1940, where he's working with his tomatoes, and you see a large patch of corn. And in behind, I'm not sure exactly what he's growing. The photo's a little blurry there. But Grandma Koos, Pauline, canned. And so they had a large shed in the back that they could use for canning work, and also in their basement. For watering, they used gray water. That is dishwater. After you wash dishes, you could take that, and she probably, is using just simple light soaps and whatnot, would use that for watering the garden. And they use the neighborhood markets for meat and for staples, neighborhood butcher shops. You can see where this Learman's meat market and grocery on South Lee Street was close to their home. They were serving, selling pork loins, a variety of lamb, a variety of things that people would want. Grandma didn't have to use a cook stove. She could use a gas stove and had a hot water heater, with a pressurized water system in Bloomington. And Vincent made his own beer. And apparently it was a matter of some humor and quote unquote embarrassment that on a hot summer day, you walk up and down West Taylor Street and you hear the bottles of beer popping from too hot of weather and tell you exactly who had made beer. Now, what happened to German foods? They went underground in many ways. The pork schnitzel, which was a classic meal, became what? The pork tenderloin. If you look at that image of American pork tenderloin, that's the kind of sandwich I called the tenderloin that devoured Cleveland. It's huge. The Frankfurter Wiener, of course, becomes the hot dog. Wieners, okay. And one I always take a bit of a stretch on, and I've been accused of overemphasizing this, but I think not, is beef rouladen, which is a wonderful German dish where you roll hammered out round steak. You really make it very, very thin by hammering it out, pounding it out, and then rolling it with pickle and onion and mustard. So a hamburger, well, a hamburger is essentially the flavor of that beef rouladen. But instead of something luscious like mashed potatoes and gravy you get with rouladen, or the beautiful red cabbage, hamburger and fries. So that's how we transformed those German foods. We forgot where they came from, but we enjoy them in many cases every day. If you want to learn more about German cooking, 3 books that I recommend. The Settlement Cookbook, which was published in Milwaukee about 1900. It's been reprinted. It's easily available. It's a German Jewish kind of cuisine. Wonderful, wonderful early 20th century cookbook. The Mennonite German Cookbook, the Mennonite Community Cookbook by Showalter is the classic of rural German American cookery. It's just irreplaceable. And for the authentic German cookery of the continent, Mimi Sheraton's The German Cookbook. All of these are easily available. So that's where we're at. Those of you who enjoy a nice cold raw kraut salad have an opportunity to dive into that beautiful jar of homemade kraut and mix it with some apples and pickles and enjoy that with your hot dog, or should I say your Wiener. So that's what I've got to say. And as I said in the old time movies, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Okay. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. The circular nature of it too, how you each were able to weave a lot of the stories back and forth was just outstanding. So thank you. Let's see.
So you are curating our questions?
I am. I got a lot of just kudos. That was great. Thank you. Gambrinus is the patron saint of beer and brewing. We got some information about that. The owner of that house at 1817 West Grove told me that his basement walls were very, very thick. Makes sense. Terra, that was great. Great presentation. While listening, I am dining on bratwurst and sauerkraut, and husband went to pick up veggies from Henry's farm CSA. Oh, Carla Bailey Smith. Which Koos is older, and will you make Koos next time?
Well, we can work at it, you know, and Chris is older and I'm smarter. That's all you need to know.
Okay, all right.
You got to have a little brotherly, you know, kind of a punching thing, you know. But thanks, Chris, for doing this thing.
Right. Oh.
So, Terra, do you have an opportunity to consult with home gardeners? Do people come to people's stands and say, okay, I've been trying to grow this and I can't figure out how to do it? And what kind of cross-fertilization, if you will, takes place in that?
Oh, all the time, especially at the farmer's market. And also my sister Teresa, who does the fruit and herbs, has started a new part of her business every spring. She just has massive amounts of plant starts for people's home gardens or patios or windowsills. I mean, anybody can grow a pot of basil or thyme or oregano or parsley, whatever, you know, herb of choice. So when Teresa got into growing plant starts, that really opened up a whole, you know, I mean, some people are doing this for the first time and had no idea, you know, what a lot of plants need full sun and a lot of homes don't have full sun. And so a lot of problems can be due to just not having enough sun. But yeah, we often do that. So we do in person at the farmer's market, and we do, you know, people email with their questions or their problems or whatever. And, you know, with all of my family's experience, we can usually help people out. there's one thing that I thought when you mentioned rhubarb earlier, though, rhubarb is native to Siberia. It wants and needs a very cold winter. And I heard from my friends who used to be interns for my brother living in Southern Illinois, they can no longer grow rhubarb in Southern Illinois. The winter is not cold enough. In another few decades or sooner, we may not be able to grow rhubarb in Central Illinois. I mean, there are things beyond our control, is I guess what I'm saying, that you can be the best gardener in the world, but if the climate is changed, it has changed and continues to change, we will have to adapt and change as well. But yes, we love to talk gardening. We love for people to grow some of their own vegetables or fruits or whatever they like, because the closer you are to your food source, the better. And that's as close as you can be, is growing it yourself.
Somebody's wondering, is it too late to plant rhubarb?
You know what? You should ask my sister.
I think you plant it in the fall. I want to say you planted it in the fall.
I was going to say that, and then I was sort of second guessing myself, because we have not planted rhubarb in about 50 years, and that's why I don't. And you can, rhubarb will stay, if you split it up, you can have, and you keep fertilizing it with, because you're not rotating your crop, so you have to bring in some fertility in the form of usually manure or hay or straw or something. So, but I believe you're right. I believe that you do plant it in the fall, and then, so no, it's not too late, in fact, and not too late at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you garden?
Myself?
Or are you so busy with helping people discover food?
No, I did grow. I do have a few things, but it's like, why should I grow when I just go a half mile, not even down the road, and I have 750 varieties of vegetables grown by my brother. So no, and besides, I'm in sort of a wooded area, so again, that sunlight problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you take advantage of what you can. I have a small urban lot, and I have found that the shade makes it easier to grow lettuce.
There you go.
And that I can grow lettuce in August.
Yeah.
When everybody else has theirs burning up, mine's doing fine.
Yeah,
so
that's
you
great.
Take advantage of the localized conditions that you have.
That's for sure. Yeah.
The last time I grew lettuce, the rabbits ate it all, and that was okay.
They need to eat too. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sad news that some people who could grow rhubarb now can't. Glad you were all talking about how to transplant. I always thought you just got rhubarb with a house and had no idea how to transplant. And let's see. Yeah.
And people you do need to split up they call them the crowns. And so you just find somebody who has an established rhubarb patch and ask and tell them you'll take, because it's good to split them and then they grow better, and take some of theirs and plant it in your own house. That's the best way to do it. Or you can order it, but why not find a neighbor?
Well, as a boy, raiding Mrs. Finley's rhubarb patch was one of the lights of the summer, because she didn't want you in there. And so the challenge became, how can you get in and get out with some nice stalks before she catches you? Because again, as a boy, there was nothing better than sit on the old wood steps of the back porch and pour some salt on some rhubarb and just chomp away at it.
Wow, that's brave. I don't think I've ever tried that. Our friend Mike Matika brought me some fresh tomatoes from his garden today.
Nice.
Is that a thing of beauty?
Yes.
Mm-hmm, that's gorgeous.
And we were just talking about how the taste is, it's transcendent. You can't get this in the supermarket. And we really miss out if we don't.
And in gardening, one of the things that happens is that you learn that the hybrids, which produce more, produce less flavor.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, one of the magical things that's happened in gardening, because I gardened with my father, and he taught me, what I needed to know. His father had taught him, so there's many generations back. But the plants that produce a few of these heritage plants that are coming back, the flavors are just incredible. I mean, they're unlike, we had some pretty good tomatoes, but I'm growing a hell of a lot better tomato than my father did. I can tell you that. And it's because it's access, to these heritage varieties. You don't get quote unquote production, but, I think our notion that perhaps production isn't all, you know?
Right, right. Oh. Do you grow cabbage for your own kraut, Tara?
Henry grows a bunch of cabbage varieties, just like he grows a lot of varieties of each vegetable. And there are some that are specifically for, have been bred for sauerkraut. I don't know quite what that means, you know, characteristics, but there's one called an arrowhead cabbage that's kind of like shaped with a kind of pyramid shape, you know, round on the bottom, pointy at the top. And that was one that was apparently a kraut cabbage. And then the Japanese have a very flat cabbage, you know, flat and low to the ground. And that one is also more for fermented, more kimchi type, but, you know, same kind of fermentation. So here's, though, is the embarrassing thing. I have never made kraut. This is something I should probably get back into. My grandmother always had crocks, big old crocks full of sauerkraut in her root cellar. And, you know, there was the windmill, and the windmill had the mechanism sort of under the ground below it. And then that was sort of a cellar area that could double as food storage. And so there was kraut, you know, crockeries down there, as well as sort of a dug root cellar in a different place. So you could store, you know, people always say, well, what are you going to do the other 6 months of the year if you eat local food? Well, people figured that out a long time ago. You can eat 12 months a year on local food. So I have not made kraut, but I'd be interested in, I should start that, because now we know that the microbiome, you know, of our guts is so important. And stuff with fermented food is excellent for our microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I make my own kraut. The photograph was one of mine. I use a system where I use a gallon jar that seals with a bale. They're called Fido jars. It's a Italian jar, and I make about 4 pounds of kraut, you know, at any particular point in time. So I'm not making big barrels of it. And this, you're right about cabbage type. The Dutch flat cabbage is my favorite one, and the cabbage does make a difference. Part of it has to do, I think, with a touch with the amount of sugar in it. And what happens, because German cuisine is really based on this interesting balance between sweet and sour. That balance is a key element, really, of German cooking. And if you get your cabbage right, your kraut right, you really get that. And so the kraut I make, and how do you make kraut? You create an anaerobic environment with salt and water and cabbage. And you open the cabbage after you cut it, you open it up to that environment by pounding it. You know, the things that people call potato mashers, most of those things, those wooden things, are really kraut pounders. And you pound it and get it into the salt brine, about a 2 to 3% salt brine. Seal it up. Make sure that you've got a way for it to expand, otherwise it'll blow up on you and you have kraut everywhere. It creates an environment in which anaerobic bacteria live, and they turn this thing sour. And it has less salt than commercial krauts, because it's, you know, commercial krauts are made with vinegar, quite often made with vinegar and salt. And it's you just can't beat it, you know. And I like it when it gets about 6 months old. You know, it starts getting a real kind of deep, almost caramely flavor to it. Carol does not enjoy my cuisine. You know, she says that she doesn't have any sauerkraut genetics. So anyway, you know.
Well, the themes too, though, like that sweet sour connection. I think that's replicated in so many different cuisine.
Mm-hmm.
And even thinking about what you said, Greg, regarding German language being banned. And then I was going back to Tara's story about the Guatemalan family and you know, history of banning or diminishing Spanish, you know, that bilingualism isn't a value, and that we recycle, like, oh yes, farm to table is good, remember? But these things that push and pull us are in some ways constant and interesting. Well, it is getting close to 7:20. So I'm going to wrap up this program. You have many fans in the chat, so thank you for sharing. And I can't wait to see the mayor again to tell how much I enjoyed his production. Our next installment of Breaking Bread is Saturday, September 11th at 1 p.m. It's a garam masala box, hot, spicy, and sexy Indian American cooking. And that's with Archana Shakara, who's the Associate Professor of Graphic Design at ISU and Art Director of Design Streak Studio. So she's definitely been a partner with this whole series all along. So that is something to look forward to. And I bid you all good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Julie.
My pleasure.